Harold Thompson woke up at exactly 5:30 a.m., just as he had done every day for the past 75 years. The morning sun hadn't yet peeked over the Montana mountains, but old habits from his military days stayed with him, refusing to let him sleep in even at the age of 93. His weathered hands reached for the wooden cane beside his bed, a constant companion in recent years. The small house on Pine Road had been his home since 1955, when he returned from the war and married his sweetheart Martha. Now, the place felt bigger without her, but Harold kept everything exactly as she had left it 5 years ago. The floral curtains still hung in the kitchen windows, and her collection of ceramic birds still watched over the living room from their shelf. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine. He shuffled to the bathroom, carefully shaved his face with an old-fashioned razor, and combed what remained of his silver hair. His reflection showed deep wrinkles earned from years under the sun, but his blue eyes remained sharp and alert, carrying secrets from his time as a military demolitions expert during World War II. After getting dressed in his usual outfit, pressed khaki pants and a clean plaid shirt, Harold made his way to the kitchen. The coffee maker, a Christmas gift from his grandson Tommy, gurgled to life. While waiting for his coffee, he looked out the window at his pride and joy, the garden. Martha had started it, and now he maintained it with the same dedication he once gave to military missions. The garden spread across his front yard like a colorful carpet. Red and yellow roses, Martha's favorites, lined the white picket fence. Tomatoes grew fat and red in their beds, and neat rows of carrots and potatoes hid beneath the soil. The neighbors often stopped to admire the garden, especially Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, who always praised his green thumb. By 7 o'clock a.m., Harold was ready for his daily walk to Sally's Diner. The small restaurant sat just 3 blocks away, and he had been having breakfast there every morning for the past 42 years. The walk took him longer now than it used to, but he refused to give it up. Exercise kept him strong, and his doctor said it was good for his heart. The bell above Sally's door chimed as Harold entered. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," called Sally herself, daughter of the original owner. She was already pouring his coffee, black, no sugar, before he reached his usual booth by the window. The vinyl seats squeaked as he settled in, placing his cane carefully against the table. "The usual, Mr. Thompson?" Sally asked, though she already knew the answer. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon had been his order since 1981. Harold nodded with a gentle smile, watching the morning crowd filter in. Most of them knew him, greeting him with respectful nods or friendly waves. Few of these people knew about the medals locked away in the wooden chest under his bed. They didn't know about the lives he had saved with his expertise in explosives, or the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in a cold sweat. To them, he was just old Mr. Thompson, the quiet veteran with the beautiful garden. After breakfast, Harold walked home slowly, stopping to chat with Mr. Chen, who ran the corner store. They talked about the weather and Mr. Chen's new grandchild, simple conversations that made the day brighter. Back home, Harold spent the morning tending to his garden, carefully pulling weeds and checking each plant for signs of trouble. The rest of his day followed its usual pattern. Lunch was a simple sandwich eaten while watching old Western movies on TV. In the afternoon, he read books about gardening or worked on the crossword puzzle from the local newspaper. Sometimes, he wrote letters to Tommy, who lived in Seattle with his family, sharing stories about the garden and the neighborhood. As evening approached, Harold sat in Martha's old rocking chair on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Life was quiet, predictable, and that's exactly how he liked it. He had seen enough excitement during the war to last several lifetimes. Little did Harold know that his peaceful routine was about to be shattered. Change was coming to Pine Road, and it would force him to confront parts of himself he thought he had left behind in 1945. The peaceful life on Pine Road changed on a Tuesday afternoon in early June. Harold was pruning his rose bushes when the rumble of motorcycles shattered the quiet. At first, he thought they were just passing through, like many bikers did on their way to the mountains. But this time was different. A group of 15 motorcycles pulled into the old Peterson gas station across the street. The station had been empty for 3 years, its windows boarded up and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. Harold watched as a tall man with a thick beard and leather vest covered in patches dismounted his bike and unlocked the station's front door. The biker's name was Marcus the Butcher Rodriguez, no relation to Harold's kind neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez. He was the president of the Dead Ravens Motorcycle Club, and he had just bought the gas station for what he called a steal of a deal at the county auction. Within hours, more bikers arrived in pickup trucks loaded with furniture, tools, and cases of beer. Harold observed from behind his rose bushes as they tore down the boards from the windows and carried in tables, chairs, and what looked like a pool table. The sound of hammers and power tools filled the air, along with loud rock music that made his windows rattle. Mrs. Rodriguez came outside to see what was happening, but quickly hurried back inside when one of the bikers whistled at her. By evening, the transformation was shocking. Neon signs blazed in the windows, and a large banner reading Dead Ravens MC, Montana chapter, hung above the door. The quiet gas station where Harold used to buy candy for Tommy during his summer visits had become something entirely different. That first night, the noise was unbearable. Motorcycles came and went until 3 in the morning. Harold lay in bed, his hands trembling slightly as the sounds of shouting and breaking glass carried across the street. The rumble of engines reminded him of the tanks in Germany, a memory he'd worked hard to forget. The next morning, Harold found beer bottles in his garden. 2 of his prized tulips had been crushed, probably by someone stumbling around in the dark. When he went to Sally's diner for breakfast, the place was unusually quiet. Through whispered conversations, he learned that the Dead Ravens had a reputation. They weren't just a motorcycle club. They were notorious for causing trouble in other towns. Best to just keep your head down, Sally advised as she refilled his coffee cup. Her hands shook slightly, and Harold noticed she kept glancing at the window. Outside, 3 motorcycles were parked in front of the diner, their owners sprawled in a booth in the corner, looking hungover and dangerous. Over the next few days, the neighborhood changed. Children no longer played in their front yards. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped tending her flower beds. The evening walks that elderly couples used to take became rare. The Dead Ravens had brought more than just noise, they brought fear. Harold watched from his porch as different people started showing up at the club. Some looked like business people in expensive cars, while others appeared homeless. They would go inside for short visits and leave quickly. He might have been old, but he wasn't naive. He recognized drug deals when he saw them. The final straw came 1 week after the Dead Ravens arrived. Harold was walking home from the diner when he saw 3 club members urinating on the town's war memorial, a small stone monument listing the names of local boys who hadn't made it home from various wars. His own brother's name was on that stone. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He sat in Martha's rocking chair, staring at the club across the street. The music thumped, motorcycles roared, and occasional fights spilled into the parking lot. The sheriff had already proven useless, claiming he couldn't do anything without real evidence of criminal activity. As Harold watched a group of bikers harass a young woman walking past the club, something shifted inside him. The trembling in his hands stopped. His jaw set firmly, and his eyes, usually warm and gentle, turned cold and calculating. The expression on his face would have been familiar to anyone who served with him in the war, but no one alive remembered that version of Harold Thompson. The quiet veteran who tended roses and did crossword puzzles began to fade away. In his place, something else emerged, something that remembered how to fight, how to plan, and most importantly, how to make things explode. Harold spent 3 days watching the Dead Ravens before he decided to talk to them. He chose a Tuesday evening, when their numbers were smaller and they seemed calmer. Taking his cane and straightening his back as much as his old bones would allow, he walked across the street to the converted gas station. The smell of cigarettes, beer, and motor oil grew stronger as he approached. 3 bikers sat on their motorcycles outside, giving him unfriendly looks. Harold noticed how they tensed up, probably not used to seeing a 93-year-old man walking straight toward them. His military training kicked in automatically. He counted 6 bikes in the parking lot, heard at least 4 voices from inside, and spotted 2 security cameras poorly hidden under the building's eaves. "Evening, gentlemen," Harold said politely, using the same calm voice he once used to keep young soldiers steady during dangerous missions. "I'd like to speak with whoever's in charge." One of the bikers, a young man with tattoos covering his neck, laughed. "Look what we got here. Father Time himself coming to pay us a visit." The others joined in the laughter, but Harold didn't flinch. He'd faced German tanks. These boys didn't frighten him. Marcus, the butcher, Rodriguez, emerged from inside, probably curious about the commotion. He was even bigger up close, at least 6'4", with arms thick as tree trunks and a beard that reached his chest. A patch on his leather vest read President in red letters. "What's your business here, old-timer?" Marcus asked, crossing his arms. His voice was surprisingly soft for such a large man, but his eyes were cold and calculating. Harold spoke clearly, keeping his voice friendly but firm. "Name's Harold Thompson. I live across the street. Just wanted to have a neighborly chat about the noise levels, especially after midnight. Some of us are trying to sleep at those hours." The silence that followed was heavy. Then Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Boys, do you hear that? Grandpa Time here needs his beauty sleep." The bikers roared with laughter. "Tell you what, old man, why don't you go back to your little garden and let us handle our business before you hurt yourself with that cane?" Harold felt something he hadn't felt in decades, a familiar calmness that used to come over him when facing danger. "Son, I'm trying to be polite here. All I'm asking is for you to keep it down after midnight." Simple request from one neighbor to another. "Or what?" the tattooed biker challenged, stepping closer. "You'll call the cops? Hit us with your cane." He knocked Harold's cane sideways, not hard enough to make him fall, but enough to show disrespect. Harold caught his balance easily, decades of military training keeping his reflexes sharp despite his age. He looked at the young man, and something in his expression made the biker step back. For just a moment, Harold's eyes weren't those of a gentle old gardener. They were the eyes of someone who had seen and done things these young men couldn't imagine. "Pick up my cane, please," Harold said quietly. The words were polite, but they carried the weight of a command. Marcus stepped forward, his face darkening. "You're on our property, old man. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pick up your own damn cane, go back to your little house, and mind your own business. And if you bother us again..." He left the threat hanging. Harold slowly bent down and retrieved his cane. As he straightened up, he spoke so only Marcus could hear. "Son, I've killed better men than you for far less reason." Then he smiled, the same gentle smile he used when giving candy to neighborhood kids. The bikers watched, suddenly uncertain, as Harold turned and walked steadily back to his house. They tried to laugh it off, but something about the old man's words and the look in his eyes bothered them. That night, they made extra noise just to prove they weren't intimidated. They revved their engines, played music even louder, and threw more bottles into Harold's garden. But Harold didn't react. He sat in his darkened house, watching through the window, his mind working with a precision he hadn't needed since the war. On his kitchen table lay a single black and white photograph. A young Harold Thompson standing with his demolition unit in Germany, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been a Nazi bunker. The time for polite requests was over. Now it was time to make a plan. The destruction of Harold's garden happened on a quiet Sunday morning. He had gone to Sally's diner for his usual breakfast, taking comfort in his daily routine despite the tension of the past week. But when he returned home, his world stopped. His beloved rose garden lay in ruins. The bushes he and Martha had planted 40 years ago were crushed, their stems broken and flowers scattered across the lawn. Motorcycle tire tracks cut deep paths through his vegetable beds, destroying the tomatoes and carrots he had carefully tended. Beer bottles and cigarette butts littered the ground, and someone had spray-painted Grand Pia Time in crude red letters across his white picket fence. Harold stood at his gate, his hands gripping his cane so tight his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Rodriguez came running from next door, tears in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Thompson, I saw them do it, but I was too scared to stop them. They were drunk from their all-night party. That horrible man with the neck tattoos led them right through your garden on their motorcycles." For several long minutes, Harold didn't move. He just stared at the destruction. The roses had been Martha's passion. Even after her arthritis got bad, she would sit in her chair and direct Harold on how to care for them. "The roses need us, Harry," she would say. "They're like family." After she passed, tending those roses had kept her memory alive. Now, as he looked at the broken stems and crushed petals, something inside Harold broke too. But it wasn't grief that filled him. It was a cold, familiar clarity. The same feeling he had in 1944 when his unit discovered what the Nazis had done to a small French village. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said quietly, "would you be kind enough to make me a copy of your security camera footage?" She blinked in surprise. Like many residents, she had installed cameras after the dead ravens arrived. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. I'll bring it right over." Harold spent the rest of the morning cleaning up what he could. He carefully gathered the broken roses, remembering how Martha would save the petals to make potpourri. Each beer bottle he picked up, he placed in a box rather than throwing them away. Every cigarette butt went into a separate container. His movements were precise, methodical, just like when he used to gather intelligence during the war. Around noon, Marcus and a few other dead ravens rode past, slowing down to admire their handiwork. "Sorry about your flowers, Grandpa," Marcus called out, laughing. "Maybe it's time to modernize your landscaping." Harold didn't respond. He didn't even look up. He just continued his careful cleanup, looking like a defeated old man. But inside, his mind was working with razor-sharp focus. That evening, after the sunset, Harold went down to his basement. Using an old key he kept around his neck, he opened a trunk he hadn't touched in decades. Inside, beneath his folded uniform and service medals, lay his wartime journals and manuals. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook filled with detailed notes about explosives and demolition techniques. The handwriting was younger, but the knowledge was still fresh in his mind. During the war, he had been known for his precision. "Thompson never wastes a charge," his commanding officer used to say. "Every blast has a purpose." Harold sat at his basement desk, Mrs. Rodriguez's security footage playing on his old laptop. He watched the bikers destroy his garden again and again, studying their faces, their bikes, their patterns of movement. In his notebook, he began making calculations, distances, timings, blast radiuses. He wasn't planning to hurt anyone. Harold Thompson had seen enough death in the war, but he remembered something else from his military days. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the explosion itself, but the fear it creates. As midnight approached, Harold heard the familiar sound of motorcycles and loud music from across the street. But tonight, it didn't bother him. Instead, he smiled slightly as he drew precise diagrams in his notebook. Martha had always said he was too patient with people who wronged him. "Sorry, my love," he whispered to her picture on his desk, "but they destroyed your roses, and some things just can't be forgiven." For the next 5 days, Harold became a ghost in his own house. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a broken old man, barely leaving his home except for his morning breakfast at Sally's diner. But appearances were deceiving. Harold was doing what he did best during the war, gathering intelligence. His bedroom became a command center. On the wall opposite his bed, hidden behind Martha's old quilt, he created a detailed map of the dead raven's operation. Using Mrs. Rodriguez's security footage and his own careful observations, he marked every camera, every entrance, and every blind spot of their clubhouse. Harold noticed things others might miss. The electricity box was poorly secured on the building's east side. The back door had a rusted lock that they rarely used. The bikers always parked their motorcycles in the same formation, the more expensive bikes closest to the front door, arranged by rank in the club. He started taking different routes on his morning walks, passing the gas station at various times. In his pocket, an old military stopwatch clicked silently as he timed the guards' rotations. The dead ravens were creatures of habit, just like the German soldiers he once studied. They had their routines, their patterns, their weaknesses. "You're looking tired, Mr. Thompson," Sally said one morning as she poured his coffee. "Are those horrible bikers keeping you up at night?" Harold gave her his gentle smile. "Oh, I'm sleeping just fine now, Sally, just fine." What he didn't tell her was that he spent his nights in his basement, carefully mixing chemicals he bought from different hardware stores across the county. Nothing dangerous, just enough to create the right kind of show. He made 3 trips to the Army surplus store 2 towns over, buying items that raised no suspicion on their own: wire, timers, simple electronics. The young clerk never suspected that this elderly customer knew exactly how to combine these innocent purchases into something much more interesting. On his kitchen table, Harold laid out old photographs from the war. One showed him with his demolition unit, standing beside the remains of a Nazi ammunition depot. Another captured the moment after they had destroyed a bridge to stop German reinforcements. Each explosion had been carefully planned, designed not just to destroy, but to send a message. "You know what your problem is, Harry?" Martha used to tell him. "You're too smart for your own good, always thinking 3 steps ahead." He smiled at the memory. She was right, of course. She usually was. Harold watched through his window as Marcus held court in front of the clubhouse, laughing with his men as they drank and harassed passing cars. The biker thought he had won, thought he had broken the old man's spirit. He had no idea he was being studied by someone who had once orchestrated explosions that changed the course of battles. In his basement, Harold organized his supplies with military precision. Each component was labeled, each wire measured exactly. He hadn't lost his touch. If anything, age had made him more patient, more precise. He could hear his old commanding officer's words. Planning is what keeps you alive in this business, Thompson. The man who rushes an explosion is a man who doesn't live to see the results. On the sixth day, Harold received a package he'd been waiting for. Special materials ordered from a mining supply company using his old military credentials. As he added them to his inventory, he thought about the dead Raven's latest activities. They had begun targeting other neighbors, breaking windows, threatening children. The sheriff remained useless, too afraid or too corrupt to intervene. That night, Harold sat in Martha's rocking chair on his porch, watching the usual party at the clubhouse. The bikers had become bolder, thinking his silence meant defeat. They had no idea they were watching the calm before the storm. One thing about explosives, Harold whispered to himself, repeating words he told young soldiers long ago, is that size doesn't matter. What matters is placement and timing. He looked at his watch. In exactly 12 hours, the dead Ravens would learn this lesson the hard way. The old demolitions expert was ready to send his message, and like all his wartime operations, this one would be precise, controlled, and impossible to ignore. The morning Harold chose for his demonstration was a Saturday, when the dead Ravens always held their biggest parties. He woke at his usual time of 5:30 a.m., shaved carefully, and put on his best clothes, dark blue slacks and a crisp white shirt. Today wasn't a day for his usual plate. Big plans today, Mr. Thompson? Sally asked when he arrived at the diner for breakfast. She noticed his formal attire. Just feeling nostalgic, Sally, he replied, eating his usual eggs and toast. Through the window, he watched 3 trucks deliver beer and supplies to the clubhouse. Perfect timing, the dead Ravens would be fully stocked for their party tonight. Throughout the day, more bikers arrived at the clubhouse. Harold counted 40 motorcycles by late afternoon. Music began blasting across the street, and the air filled with cigarette smoke and loud laughter. He noticed Marcus strutting around, showing off his new motorcycle, an expensive black machine he parked right by the front door. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Harold went to his basement. His hands moved surely and steadily as he checked his equipment one final time. Everything was prepared, measured, and tested. He'd chosen an empty field behind the gas station for his demonstration. Far enough to be safe, close enough to send his message. The charges were already in place, buried 2 days ago during his night walks. To anyone watching, he looked like a confused old man wandering with his cane. Nobody noticed him carefully marking spots with small stones, or the way he'd take different paths each time, slowly completing his setup. At 8:30 p.m., the party was in full swing. Harold could feel the bass from their music shaking his windows. Through his binoculars, he watched the bikers drinking, fighting, and harassing passing cars. Some were doing drug deals right in the open, thinking the darkness would hide their actions. Time to wake them up, Harold muttered, reaching for the detonator he'd built. It was a simple device, nothing fancy, but then again, he'd learned during the war that simple was often better. Fewer things to go wrong. At precisely 9:00 p.m., Harold pressed the button. The first explosion lit up the night sky like lightning. A column of dirt and grass shot up from the empty field behind the clubhouse, accompanied by a thunderous boom that set off car alarms all down the street. The music at the clubhouse stopped instantly. Before the bikers could react, a second charge went off, then a third. Each explosion was perfectly timed, creating a circle of controlled blasts around the empty field. The ground shook, windows rattled, and the air filled with the smell of explosives that Harold remembered so well from his war days. The dead Ravens poured out of the clubhouse in panic. Some jumped on their bikes, others ran on foot, all of them looking wildly around for the source of the explosions. Marcus stood in the parking lot, his face pale, watching the last of the charges create a perfect ring of disturbed earth around his territory. Harold waited exactly 5 minutes after the final explosion. Then, using his cane, he walked slowly but confidently across the street. The bikers parted before him like water, many of them looking at the old man with new eyes. "Good evening, gentlemen," Harold said calmly, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "I trust I have your attention now." Marcus stepped forward, trying to look tough but unable to hide his shock. You did this?" Harold smiled, not his usual gentle smile, but the cold smile he'd worn in France when facing down Nazi officers. "Consider this a professional demonstration. The next show won't be in an empty field." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I trust we can now have a civilized conversation about noise levels and property respect." The bikers stared at him, then at the smoking field behind their clubhouse. The precision of the explosions, the perfect timing, the careful placement. This was no amateur work. This was military grade. "You're insane," Marcus whispered, but his voice shook. "No, son," Harold replied quietly. "I'm a demolitions expert with nothing left to lose. Sleep on that thought tonight." He turned and walked back home, leaving behind a crowd of silent, shaken bikers. For the first time in weeks, Pine Road was perfectly quiet. The morning after the explosions, Harold put on his old military uniform. It took him some time to get all the medals properly placed. There were quite a few of them. The uniform was a bit loose now. Age had shrunk his frame, but the shoulders still sat straight and proud. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., just as the hungover bikers were starting to stir in their clubhouse, Harold walked across the street. This time, he carried a thick brown envelope instead of his usual cane. The dead ravens watched him approach, their eyes now showing a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Get Marcus," someone whispered. The bikers had stopped using their usual disrespectful nickname Grandpa Time after last night's display. Marcus came out looking rough. His eyes were bloodshot, and he'd clearly gotten no sleep. He stopped short when he saw Harold in full military dress. The medals caught the morning sun: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross, and others that told stories of valor most people couldn't imagine. "May we talk inside?" Harold asked politely. "What I have to share shouldn't be discussed in the open." His voice was gentle but carried the weight of command. Marcus found himself nodding before he even realized it. Inside the clubhouse, Harold sat at their bar, carefully laying the envelope on the counter. The place smelled of stale beer and fear. About 20 bikers gathered around, keeping their distance but unable to hide their curiosity. "First," Harold said, opening the envelope, "let me introduce myself properly. Master Sergeant Harold Thompson, United States Army, 1st Special Service Force, demolitions expert, 1942 to 1945. He spread out old photographs and documents across the bar. The first photo showed a young Harold with his unit in France. The second captured him receiving a medal from a general. But it was the third photo that made the bikers lean in close. It showed the aftermath of one of his demolition operations. A Nazi fortress reduced to rubble with surgical precision. "During the war," Harold continued, his voice steady, "my unit had a specific job. We didn't just blow things up, we sent messages. Sometimes, destroying a bridge wasn't about the bridge itself, but about showing the enemy what we could do to their other bridges." He pulled out more documents, official military records, mission reports, and letters of commendation. Many were marked classified, with recent declassification stamps. The bikers read in silence, their faces growing paler with each page. "That field last night?" Harold pointed out the window. "That was approximately 1/10 of what I can do, and I've gotten more precise with age, not less." Marcus picked up one of the mission reports, reading about how Harold's unit had systematically dismantled German defenses along the French coast. "Why are you showing us this?" he asked, his voice unusually quiet. "Because," Harold said, "I want you to understand something. I'm not some helpless old man you can bully. I'm not a joke you can laugh at. I'm someone who has forgotten more about strategic demolition than most people will ever know." He stood up slowly, his uniform crisp despite the musty bar air. "Now we can have a reasonable discussion about how to be good neighbors." Or, he let the sentence hang, not needing to finish it. One of the older bikers stepped forward. Harold noticed the faded Marine Corps tattoo on his arm. "I served too," the biker said quietly. "Not like you, but I served. Boys," he turned to his fellow club members, "this man's not kidding. Those medals? They don't give those out for perfect attendance." A heavy silence fell over the clubhouse. Harold watched as understanding dawned on their faces. These men had spent their lives trying to appear dangerous, but now they were face to face with someone who had actually lived it. "What do you want?" Marcus finally asked. Harold smiled, his real smile this time, not the cold one from last night. "I want my neighborhood back. I want my roses replanted. And I want you to understand that respect isn't earned by fear alone." He gathered his documents back into the envelope, leaving one photo on the bar, the one of his demolition unit. "Study that picture," he said as he turned to leave. "Think about what it means. Then ask yourselves, do you really want to be at war with the man who took that photograph?" As Harold walked out, he heard the bikers begin to talk among themselves. He didn't need to hear their words. The message had been received. The change in Pine Road didn't happen overnight, but it happened surely and steadily over the next few weeks. The first sign came early one morning when Harold stepped outside to find 6 dead Ravens members carefully removing the spray paint from his fence. Marcus himself supervised the work, making sure every letter was completely gone. "Good morning," Harold said, walking down his front path with his morning coffee. "Sir," Marcus replied, and Harold noticed the difference in his tone. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something closer to respect. "We'll have your garden fixed by the end of the week. Got some professional landscapers coming in." True to their word, the next day a landscaping truck arrived. Harold watched from his porch as the bikers worked alongside the professionals, preparing the soil and planting new rose bushes. They'd even found the same varieties that Martha had loved, though Harold didn't ask how they'd managed that. The noise levels dropped dramatically. The all-night party stopped, and the music, when they played it, stayed at a reasonable volume. The drug deals disappeared from the street corners. Mrs. Rodriguez started tending her flowers again, and children returned to playing in their front yards. But the most surprising change came about 2 weeks after Harold's visit to the clubhouse. He was working in his newly restored garden when he heard motorcycles approaching. This time, however, they weren't roaring or revving, just the steady purr of well-maintained engines. Marcus pulled up to Harold's gate, along with 5 other senior club members. "Master Sergeant Thompson," he called out respectfully, "got a minute to talk?" Harold stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "Of course, and Harold is fine." Marcus looked uncomfortable for a moment. "We've been doing some thinking. The club. We want to do better. Be better. That Marine vet in our group, Jimmy, he's been talking to us about honor, about what it means to be part of something bigger than ourselves." Harold listened as Marcus explained their new plan. The Dead Ravens wanted to become more than just a motorcycle club. They wanted to be part of the community. It started by offering protection to local businesses, but the legitimate kind this time, not extortion. They were organizing charity rides for the local veterans hospital. "We were wondering," Marcus said, looking down at his boots, "if you consider being something like an advisor to us. Share some of your experience, your wisdom. Help us understand what real strength looks like." Harold thought about Martha, about what she would say. She always believed in second chances. "On one condition," he said finally. "Every Saturday, you help me tend these roses." And so began the strangest partnership Pine Road had ever seen. Every Saturday morning, Dead Ravens members could be found in Harold's garden, learning about roses and life from a 93-year-old demolitions expert. They started calling him Sarge, not as a joke, but as a title of respect. The clubhouse changed too. The neon signs came down, replaced by a simple Dead Ravens Veterans Support Chapter sign. They still had their parties, but now they were community barbecues where neighbors felt welcome. The parking lot where drug deals once happened became a meeting place for local veterans. 6 months after the night of explosions, Harold sat in his usual booth at Sally's Diner. The morning crowd now included a mix of elderly residents and leather-clad bikers, all greeting each other by name. Through the window, he could see his garden blooming better than ever, with Dead Ravens members already gathering for their Saturday morning gardening lesson. "More coffee, Sarge?" asked Jimmy, the Marine veteran who now made sure club members treated the diner with respect. "Thank you, son," Harold replied, smiling as he watched Marcus help Mrs. Rodriguez carry her groceries across the street. That evening, sitting in Martha's rocking chair on his porch, Harold looked at the old photograph of his demolition unit. "Well, my love," he whispered, "sometimes the best victories don't come from destroying things. Sometimes they come from helping things grow. Across the street, the dead ravens were holding their weekly community dinner. The sound of laughter and friendly conversation drifted over on the evening breeze, along with the sweet scent of roses in full bloom. Harold Thompson, Master Sergeant, demolitions expert, and now unlikely mentor to a motorcycle club, smiled contentedly. At 93, he had fought one last battle, and won it not with explosions, but with wisdom, courage, and a garden full of roses.